they're not all doom and gloom. The prophets seem to and do pronounce God's judgment, but at the same time, there's always some parallel promise for the future, good for the good. Okay, so if you just take a look at the middle of that section where I've evened them off, and the other thing to remember when you're dealing with the prophets, don't expect everything to be in order. Throughout the whole history of the writing of the prophets, interpreters and prophets themselves move the verses around to fit particular purposes. They're all attributed to Isaiah, but they don't necessarily come, in order that we would like to see it. But the themes are there. So, and I'm just going to give you an example. In Isaiah, this is not on your sheet, so I'll read them to you. Isaiah 1:2-6. He casts judgments. And I think there's a line in here which I think is one of the most powerful lines in Isaiah. But he says in chapter 1, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Sons I have reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me." This is the verse I think that is absolutely powerful. "The ox knows its owner, and the ass its master's crib. But Israel does not know, my people does not understand." Right? And then, but as a parallel to that, in the beginning of chapter 2, so notice, there's all of this condemnation in chapter 1. All of a sudden, there's a promise given in chapter 2, and he says, the word which Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths." So you see there's a constant back and forth, and you can take the notes and look at it yourself following back and forth. I read a very interesting comment about interpretation of the scriptures. I was reading an article on Islam and the idea of vengeance and violence in the Quran. And the person who was writing the article obviously does contend, and I tend to agree with them, that Islam is not, or the Quran is not a scripture of vengeance. But he said in terms of interpretation, when it comes to interpreting any scriptures, he says, if you are a vengeful person, if you are a hateful person, if you are a bigoted person, you will interpret the scriptures as you see them, wanting strict justice, wanting vengeance, wanting to see God as a wrathful God. If you are on the other side of the fence, you will interpret the scriptures from the other point of view, that God is love, merciful, and so on. And I think that's very important for us to remember. We don't come to interpret scriptures as a tabula rasa. We come with our own prejudices, our own historical conditions. If you are not one in favor of if you have certain prejudices against the poor, you'll have a very difficult time reading the Christian and Jewish scriptures as God opting for the poor. So it's sometimes I say some people let their politics determine their morality, and should really be the other way around. But anyway, so I just wanted to kind of give you that perception as we read Isaiah, who is very, very prejudiced in favor of the poor, of justice, and so on. So let me begin. In these first few chapters, we're going to look at a couple of parables, parable of the vineyard. We're going to look at the call of Isaiah and listen to see how Isaiah understands Israel and the Lord. The first thing we want to say is Isaiah knows that God is angry with his people, and his power can be destructive. So the first quote, "Therefore the wrath of the Lord blazes against his people. He raises his hand to strike them. When the mountains quake, their corpses shall be like refuse in the streets. For all this, his wrath is not turned back, and his hand is still outstretched." But there's a but here, obviously. God's destructiveness, and I think this is probably one of the most important concepts we have to understand if we're still within the mindset that the God of the Old Testament is a wrathful God. And then people tend to compare Old Testament God with the New Testament God. Folks, it's the same God. For Christians, Jesus is a Jewish person whose God is the God of the Old Testament, if you want to put it in those terms. So what we have to remember, and I think we can apply this to our own lives, is God's destructiveness is due to his concern for righteousness and to his intolerance of injustice. Humans seem to have no sense for the true dimension of man's cruelty to man. Very important. God manifests his anger, his wrath. No question. But at what? At injustice. I mean, we are the same way. Right? If we see situations of injustice, terrific poverty, of violence, I would hope that our first response would be anger. Righteous anger. The anger of God. So yes, I mean, don't forget what we're doing too, is we are making God out to be like us. This is what we call an anthropomorphic God. God is like human beings. So we understand terms like justice and anger. So the wrath that we see in God is the wrath of what we would call justifiable anger. And in his wrath, he wants to see he wants to see justice done. He wants to see righteousness carried out. So please remember that. Absolutely crucial. And it should hopefully shut up many of these Christians who try to make the God of the Old Testament out to be this God of wrath. But the book of Isaiah opens with a speech that sets the tone for all the further sayings of Isaiah. It's not about God's anger, but it has to do with the sorrow of God. Notice how he's playing on the feelings of that they would understand, human feelings. So it's dealing with the sorrow of God. God's children have abandoned him. So, again, in the scriptural quotes, under abandoned, "Hear, O heavens, and listen, O earth, for the Lord speaks. Sons have I raised and reared, but they have disowned me." An ox knows its owner, and an ass its master's manger. But Israel does not know. My people has not understood. And so on. So, we read that to you before. Isaiah conveys his impression of God's mood to the kings. Most of the prophets are coming to speak not just to the people, but to the leaders, to the kings. They are the ones who are called on and are responsible for following God's law, for being faithful to the covenant. So the directive is to the kings, the leaders of the people. God's patience is exhausted. He is tired of he's tired of man. Man has become a burden and a sorrow for God. What care I for the number of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of whole burnt rams and fat of fatlings. In the blood of calves, lambs, and goats, I find no pleasure. When you come in to visit me, who asks these things of you? Trample my courts no more. Bring no more worthless offerings. Your incense is loathsome to me. New moon and Sabbath, calling of assemblies, octaves with wickedness, these I cannot bear. Your new moons and festivals I detest. They weigh me down. I tire of the load. When you spread out your hands, I close my eyes to you. Though you pray the more, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. So God is weary. He's weary of the nonsense and the sinfulness of human beings. And we also have to know and remember, and I mentioned this before, what does the prophet do to prophesy? Prophet is not one who looks into a crystal ball and predicts the future. It's more practical than that. The prophet reads the signs of the times, takes a look at the signs of the times and says to people, notice, if you keep doing what you're doing, then inevitably this will happen. And I think what you have to remember here too, what Isaiah is looking at is where the northern kingdom, don't forget the kingdom has been split now, north and south. The northern kingdom, known as Israel, has been taken over by Assyria. They have become a vassal of Assyria. They are no longer free. And what Isaiah is doing is he's looking at that and saying, this was once our people. And look what happened to them when they weren't faithful. And so he looks and he says, look at what happens to the north. And if you keep doing what you're doing, which is pretty much what they're doing, you too will end up a vassal, which ultimately they did. They ended up in exile in Babylon. God may be angry, but there is sorrow in God's anger. The wrath of God, interestingly enough, comes into history through the instrumentality of other nations. So what practically we're saying is that God has used Assyria as his instrument to take over the northern kingdom. And as we'll see, Babylon becomes God's instrument to send Judah, the southern kingdom, into exile. So again, that's the perspective of what we're dealing with here. Isaiah is animated by a sense of dread and the awareness of the transcendent mystery and exclusiveness of God. And we'll see where that comes from. It comes from his calling and his vision of God during his calling. To Isaiah, Israel is God's vineyard. A very important concept. He uses these examples. For example, for Isaiah, Israel is the vineyard. But then you take the prophet Hosea, where Israel becomes or takes on, Hosea, the prophet Hosea's consort. He marries a prostitute who is unfaithful to him. And so you have that balance there where Israel is the prostitute and, Hosea is speaking for God. Right? So these images that are being used are very powerful images. Let let me read to you what I think is, again, one of the great parables in the Old Testament. And I want you to listen and see. Now, some of you, I've heard me say this before, but I would like you to listen to what happens in this parable. It's in chapter 5. Let me sing for my beloved a love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He digged it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. And he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove the hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its walls, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold, a cry. Does anybody pick up anything that happened in that parable besides the obvious images? It's the bloodshed again. It's the bloodshed that the rich have imposed upon the poor. It's the bloodshed that, again, it's a metaphorical use of bloodshed. But again, even in the north, there is always some fighting that causes bloodshed. All right. But if you look at this particular parable, something very interesting happens. Remember, we defined a prophet as one who was called by God, right, to speak for God. Okay. Well, if you look at the first part of this parable, he says, "Let me sing for my beloved, a love song concerning his vineyard." First couple of verses. Verse 5, "And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, between me and my vineyard." What has just happened? He's gone from the third person to the first person. All right, so what we have here is a true understanding of what it means for a prophet to speak for God. He starts out by talking about God and his beloved vineyard. All of a sudden, God begins to speak. What will I do now? Okay, so with this parable, okay, we see that first of all, the prophet speaks first in his own name as the voice of God, and then the voice of the prophet explains the parable. So what do we gain from this, or what do we see from this? Well, first of all, we see a personal attitude of Isaiah that comes out in this. It's the prophet's love of God, my friend, my beloved, a love song about his vineyards. So Isaiah is pretty much personally invested here. We see the prophet's sympathy for God, whose care for the vineyard has been of no avail. We see God's sorrow, not the people's tragedy, all right, which is the theme of the song. It's God's sorrow, not the people's tragedy. Isaiah alludes to grief and disappointment of God over the vineyard he had rejoiced in. So again, that interplay between Isaiah and God. why did God plant the vineyard? To yield righteousness and justice. But the fruit it yielded was violence and outrage, arousing God's anger. He speaks of the moral corruption of the leaders that shattered God's relationship to his people. I think what I'll do now, we can go back to some of these. One of the things I want you to look at is, or to hear is the two sympathies of the prophet. There's a sympathy for God. So when Isaiah speaks to the people, he is emotionally one with God. But in the presence of God, he is emotionally one with the people. He sings out in verse 6. He's singing as a member of this people, and he's singing out to God in chapter 6. Then I said, how long, O Lord? How long? And he said, until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without men, and the land is utterly desolate. And the Lord removes men far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. Now, here is where there is that sign of hope. And though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains standing when it is filled. The holy seed is the stump. So in the midst of Isaiah crying out, how long are we going to endure this? God responds, but at the end he says, there will be a remnant that will remain. Even though it's a stump, that stump will be the seed of this remnant that will grow into Israel once again. So Israel, in order to be redeemed, God must purify them. And the process of purification will be grim and dreadful. There is no redemption without affliction. So we have the kind of the personal feelings of Isaiah as he's relating to God. Now, let's quickly look at Isaiah's call. Remember we said that prophets are people called by God, to speak for God. So let's look at his call. It's it's chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died. Okay, now this is the way they give historical points. Okay, they always relate it to the reign of a particular king, or obviously there are no dates back then. They're not going to say, well, this was written, 800 years before Christ. It has no relationship to them. Always put it in the context of who is reigning. Okay. I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. So picture God is on a throne over the temple, and his train of his robe covers the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. Right. Smoke being, again, the sign of the presence of God. Just as it was during the Exodus. And I said, now this is Isaiah speaking, woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. So he's relating himself to being a member of this people. For my eyes have seen the King and the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphim to me, having in his hand a burning coal, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is forgiven. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here I am, Lord, send me. And he said, go and say to the people. Now here's what seems to be almost the irrationality of what's going on. Hear and hear, but do not understand. See and see, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people fat and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, and lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. So, what do we see here in this call? Well, we see the Lord on his throne. We're seeing that, as I said, his train covering the temple, the seraphim, the angels, the announcers. We see a world full of his glory. I think the allusion to God's glory being spread out over the whole world, not just over Israel. The foundation shook. These signs of kind of earthquakes and smoke being the signs of the presence or the coming of God. We have a man of unclean lips dwelling in the midst of his people. His eyes have seen the King. Seraphim touches his lips and purifies him. He responds to the call, whom shall I send? Send me. The mandate that Isaiah receives, God tells him, okay, here's what you do. You're going to go out and you're going to preach to these people, and guess what? They're not going to listen to you. Well, I'm giving you the power to go out and speak in my name, and these people will be, their hearts will be hardened, and they will not listen. It's a mandate which is a contradiction of being a prophet. Okay? Obviously, you would want the prophet to be heard, but here the contradiction is, you will preach, you will be heard, but not understood. So, I think that in many ways we can understand the psyche of Isaiah as a prophet. It's very frustrating. It's a call, and we will see hopefully later on at some point that the prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah go through the same call, which is rather a difficult call, right? But they all receive this call. And so for Isaiah, it's going to be, right from the beginning, he's going to say, well, what good is it being a prophet if they're not going to listen to me? You're going to add to my frustration? All right? And yet, this falls within, just as God hardened the heart of Pharaoh, he's going to harden the heart of these people. And we're going to leave it there hanging. And we will continue next time to see more of Isaiah's message. But these are kind of the personal reflections of Isaiah himself. So I turn it over now to my buddy here and let him fill in the blanks.
It's always amazing to hear Don. He's filling in a lot of blanks for me in this matter. So I'll just go ahead and try to fill out some of the blanks. Really just compare it to Jewish tradition. So I actually would like to start from at the end where Don just finished. I'd like to start with actually the image that Don just finished with, and it's the beginning of chapter 6 of Isaiah. And I'll read it just to remind yourself. In the year of King Uzziah's death, so the death here, the Jewish sources say that he had tzara'at, leprosy, And actually, just yesterday in synagogue, this Shabbat, we were talking about the tzara, the leprosy, what is believed to be something that looks like the modern leprosy, and his actual death. So there's different opinions of what that meant. But either way, the tzara is a spiritual disease. So it is likened to death. And you have to redeem yourself and put yourself back in water, living water, in order to redeem yourself. And what it really essentially is, it's a disease that something is wrong between the balance between your physical and your material. You can wrap this also in the idea of the wine, which we'll look at. The image of the wine, the vineyard, is very, very strong here from chapter 1 through chapter 6, and we will talk about that. Essentially, I feel like this is too... The idea is that wine, just like the idea of the leprosy, is when you're taking one side too much. You're taking one step too far. So it could be very good, or it could be very bad. And of course, we'll look at it. So the idea here is that Uzziah's death, so something happened to the king. And when the king dies, or the king is doing something wrong, it affects everybody. It sets the tone for everybody. And Isaiah says, I saw the Lord sitting upon the high and holy throne, and its legs filled the temple. Seraphim were standing above and his service. Each one had 6 wings. With 2, it would cover its face. With 2, it would cover its legs. And with 2, it would fly. And one would call to another and say, holy, holy, holy. And this is something that we say in synagogue all the time. We quote this verse, Master of legions, the whole world is filled with his glory. Doorpost moved many cubits at the sounds of the calling of the temple, and the temple became filled with smoke. Okay, so smoke, like Don said, is the symbol of God coming to earth with fire, smoke, and so forth. The first time we see that in God's revelation through smoke or fire, what was it? Where was it? In the wilderness, where? The mountain was before. It wasn't the mountain, but not the Mount Sinai as we think the big revelation. It was before. The burning bush. Very good. That was the first time that God reveals himself to a person like that we see in fire. So immediately we look at it and we say, oh, that's like Moses, right? And we'll see how it actually is one-to-one with Moses. Same, almost the same revelation and same discussion. So then I said, Isaiah says, then I said, woe is me, for I am doomed, for I am a man of impure lips. Right? Does it remind us something? Impure lips. What did Moses tell God when he says, I want you to go save the people? He said, Arez Fatayim. I have problem with my lips. Not even, in the translation, we always say, he couldn't speak, but the words in Hebrew is Arez Fatayim. I have problems with my lips. So the Midrashim say that why would Moses have problem with his lips or speech? Because when he grew up in the house of Pharaoh, they knew he was a Hebrew baby, and they wanted to know where his loyalty lie. So they gave him a bucket or a vessel with gold and a vessel with coals, with fire, but with coals. So they kind of looked the same. And they wanted to know, will he go for the coals or will he go for the gold? And somehow the baby went for the gold. And now they knew that if he would go for the gold, it means that his heart is with the gold, meaning he's not a spiritual person, and he would be eventually an enemy to the kingdom, because if his heart is already from being baby, he wants the gold, and Egypt had a lot of gold, right? He'll want to take the gold of Egypt. And the Midrash says that an angel came and moved his hand to the coal. And he took the coal and he put it in his mouth and it burned his lips. And that's where he became Arez Fatayim. He had a problem with his lips. Okay, so this is one idea that the Talmud brings to tell us why Moses was, in a sense, had a physical issue. But the point is that he's pushing himself away. Right? He says he's trying to get an excuse. He's saying, I can't. You're telling me I can, but I'm telling you I can't. Right? Isaiah does the same thing. He pushes back. So then we continue, and then for I'm a man of impure lips, and I dwell among a people with impure lips. So here, he's not just bringing it to himself, but he says all the people have a problem with the lips. Now, the midrashim that say that Uzziah died from leprosy, we have to understand the leprosy in Jewish tradition is called tzara'at, and it comes from there's a list of 7 sins that a person might commit to get that spiritual disease. And they all have to do with somehow the connection between the heart and the mouth. Something is imbalanced. When we say that one in the heart and one in the mouth, which means that we're not honest, right? So it may not necessarily be something that is a physical affliction, but actually it was something that the population had a problem with. And if the tradition says that Uzziah died of leprosy, it means that he set the tone, and he was a person that had a problem with his lips. The Talmud actually looks at it as a motzi shem ra. Metzora is motzi shem ra, giving someone a bad name. But it means that you're using your lips in the wrong way. Okay, so he says this is a problem with all the people, and I'm one of those, and I don't think you should basically pick me for your prophet. So he says, for I am a man of impure lips, and I dwell among a people with impure lips, for my eyes have seen the King. And he says the King, God, master of legions. So he's saying, who am I to do what you're asking me to do? One of the seraphim flew to me, and in his hand was a coal. He had taken it with tongues with atop of the altar. He touched it on my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity has gone away, and your sin shall be atoned for. So, in a sense, what this text does, it says, I'm now actually, you think you are, you use your lips in a wrong way. I will, in a sense, burn your sin. right? It's a measure for measure. I will correct you where you're wrong. So it's an interesting conversation, because what God is saying to Isaiah, what you see as affliction, I actually see as an advantage. So we see, it says that our tradition says that a person sees to the eyes, right? And Isaiah says, I saw the king, right? He's referring to the eyes. We judge as people, we judge with our eyes. But the Talmud says God is looking to the heart. And we can't see the heart of people. We can only see what we see. But God sees our heart. And what we see as affliction, God sees an advantage. What is the purpose of seeing that as affliction? Because Moses does the same thing. He sees himself as afflicted. So what is wrong with that? Or what is good with that? Actually, it becomes an advantage. In the relationship with God, it becomes an advantage. Why? Why would someone who sees themselves as in a sense, handicapped, it becomes an advantage in the relationship with God? Exactly. Because that causes us to be humble. We're not perfect. So it doesn't matter what caused that. But if we see ourselves as lower, that is the point. And God said, other people can be afflicted and they don't think they're afflicted. And that is the message here. That I'm afflicting them and they don't even know they're afflicted. And if they don't know they're afflicted, how will they return? How will they get the message that they're not perfect, that they need to do something about what to improve what they're doing? And that is the point. We'll continue. So he says, now all your sins are atoned for. I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who shall go for us? So Moses asked the same thing, right? He says, he asked God, whom shall I say sent me? When I go to Egypt, who do I say that sent me? And I said, here I am, send me. So the idea of saying, I am here I am, God said to Moses, you say, Eheyeh asher eheyeh. God said in Moses' conversation, he said, you should say that, what is my name? God said to Moses, what is my name? Eheyeh asher eheyeh. I will be as I will be. Right? So for God, it's always I will be as I will be, but for us as people, it's here I am. It has to be here. And then he sends him. So this and what is Isaiah's message? What is he supposed to tell the people? He has to tell them, you're too fat. You're too fat. You have to whatever, if it's physically or spiritually, you're too fat. We just finished the Passover holiday, and we're counting 49 days to Shavuot, and this is exactly the idea, to stop eating the bread that rises, and this is exactly what he says. You're too fat, and what is very, very fat is his heart. The heart is fat. In verse 10, he said, go and say to the people, surely you hear, but you do not comprehend. And surely you see, but you fail to know. This people is fattening its heart. So the fact that you can't hear, it's not because you have a problem with your hearing and you need a hearing aid, it's because you're not listening. And the same thing, you're not comprehending because your heart is fat. And if your heart is fat, it's blocked. Now, Don was mentioning a very important concept about there's no redemption without affliction. And we see that all the time. That the redemption has to come with affliction. Now, affliction, we say a sacrifice. So whatever that affliction is, it's a sacrifice. So in order to return to hearing God, to comprehend, we have to give up something. And that's our sacrifice. Now we have to really give it up. We can't just pretend we're giving it up, right? Because if we're pretending to give it up, we're not doing anything. So I'm going back to the beginning of chapter 1 where we began. And it says, the vision of Isaiah, son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah. And then he says that these kings of Judah, hear, O heaven, and give ear, O earth. For God has spoken, children have I raised. This is a very famous phrase in the Jewish tradition. You hear it all the time. Children have I raised and exalted, but they have rebelled against me. An ox knows his owner, and a donkey his master's trough. Even an ox knows where he gets the food from, and the donkey where their food comes from. And the people of Israel don't know that. But Israel does not know. My people does not comprehend. Okay, so it's important to see at the end when he says you have a heavy heart or you have a fat heart. That's why you can't understand the message. Now, I want to concentrate on that, all the part in the middle. And all the parts in the middle between the beginning and the end has a lot of references to the vineyard, to the wine. So, I'd like to look at that. So, wine, in our tradition is considered something that can elevate the heart. It says that a wine will yesamach levav enosh, will make the heart of a person happy. Okay, so it puts someone in the mood, so to speak. But if you do it too much, right, that's bad. And by the way, that's why we use wine for every service. Every Jewish service has wine. It's almost taking that, what we see that could be harmful, and taking the antidote to it. Taking a small drink of it, and to say, we're in control of it, you're not in control of us. Where do we see the first vineyard? Where do we see the first vineyard in the Bible? The what? Garden of Eden. Okay, I wanted to hold with that, but it's not in the Garden of Eden. It's not clear that it's a vineyard, but we'll get to it. But actual text says a vineyard is with Noah. When Noah comes out of the ark, he plants a vineyard and he gets drunk. Okay, so he is trying again to bring in the Garden of Eden, to replant the Garden of Eden, but he too is in imbalance. He uses it with imbalance. The wine is likened to the human being. Why? When the human being was created on a Friday, God says this is very good. All the rest of the days of creation was good, but Friday was very good. And the Talmud says, why is it very good? Because the human Adam was created on Friday, so that's very good. But in the same breath, it says, as much as it can be very good, it can also be very bad. So when a human being is corrupt, it's very corrupt.
And that really changes the balance. Wine is the same thing. It's tov me'od. It's very good. But when you overdo it, it becomes very bad. Because it takes you away from focus. It takes you away from God. You then start thinking that you are God. And you can then create, it's mind altering. It's a mind altering substance. Now, it's one thing to alter the mind a little bit, and that's it's okay to alter the mind a little bit to be happy and to get into the moment, into the space. But if you do it too much, then you go away. And this is exactly what God is telling the people. I'm creating a vineyard on earth. I'm trying to create a vineyard on earth. What am I essentially trying to do? I'm trying to bring substance, and we don't call it spirit for nothing. I'm trying to bring a substance, a heavenly substance to earth, but I'm asking you to handle it correctly. And we see, and we will start from the Garden of Eden, which was misused. As God says, one of the opinions in the Talmud of what it is that the tree of knowledge is grapes, is the products of grapes. And if you're a Nazirite, if you're a monk, right, you have to abstain from wine, from any product of grapes, not just from wine. Any product of grape you have to abstain from. Which means that if you want to come back to focus or to balance, you have to stay away from that substance that takes you away. So God is saying, as I created you in the Garden of Eden on Friday, and it was very good, I am likened you. I'm comparing you to a vineyard that I am nurturing. That's where it comes that you know the human being is like the wine. It's something that is elevated. It's not a regular animal. We're an animal, but we're not a regular animal. We're something elevated. Same thing. A vineyard is a tree, it's a plant, but there's something elevated in it. Same thing for the people of Israel. I'm creating you. I'm trying to make you something a little elevated. You're a nation like the other nations, but with my Torah, with my teachings to you, I'm trying for you to elevate a little bit. And what you're doing, you're abusing it. You're taking one step too far. I'm asking you to create cherubim on top of the Holy Ark. What you're doing is you're taking that and you're making your own statues. I didn't tell you to make all statues. I asked you to make these specific statues. But you're taking it and you're making it your own. So you're creating your own God. And you're forgetting who is the God that really created you. So all that Isaiah is trying to bring back to focus. I want to give one comparison to the Garden of Eden, which is a comparison that is often brought in terms of when you trying to speak to me again, if you're not bringing honest sacrifice, I will not listen to you. I will not take your sacrifice. You have to bring an honest and authentic sacrifice. So the same angels, in a sense, that protect the Garden of Eden, the return to the Garden of Eden, are the same angels or the same figures that God is asking the people of Israel to create on top of the ark. So in Genesis, when Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden,
God says, and God said, behold, man has become like the unique one among us, knowing good and bad, meaning that he tasted of that substance that he can see beyond, right? But he doesn't know how to handle it. And now, lest he put forth his hand to take also from the tree of life, and the tree of life is the word of God, translated as later on is the Torah, and eat and live forever. So if you can't handle this, you definitely won't be able to handle God's word. So God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the soil from which he has been taken, and having driven out the man, he stationed at the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim and the flame of the ever-turning sword to guard the way to the tree of life. Okay, so there are cherubim with swords and a flame, right? A flame of ever-turning sword. So God is in that flame, right? We say that the flame is God, between the cherubim. If we skip to when God tells the people to build the ark for the temple, he says, and you shall make a cover of pure gold, 2.5 cubits its length, and 2.5 cubits, and 2 cubits and a half its width. You shall make 2 cherubim, same word, of gold, hammered out, shall you make them from both ends of the cover. You shall make the cherub from one end at the one side, and one cherub from the end of the other. So here we are. God is saying, I'm giving you another target here to focus on. This is the entrance back to me through those cherubim. And those cherubim are where the conversation happens. In Isaiah, God is saying, if you don't bring if you don't bring the honest sacrifice, meaning to the temple, which is the Ark of the Covenant, of course, symbolizes that, I will not speak to you. Okay? And it says, one of the verses here that you will bring your sacrifice, but I will not answer them. So the conversation that happens between the cherubim, I'm not going to let you go through it because you're drunk. You took my word and you took it extra step. I just want to finish with what we'll read actually this Shabbat in the synagogue. The 2 sons of Aaron bringing sacrifice, and they die. The day that the inauguration of the temple, and it says they brought a foreign fire. So the commentaries are that they took whatever God requested them to do, but they took it a step further. And that was their wrong. They were too creative with God's word. So we read that a couple last week, and then next week we're going to read what happens after they died. But the point is, and this is when I was preparing for today, the sentence that I had to title this speech today was that you're taking it a step further. And a step further in God's words is, I don't see anything wrong with me. I'm in charge. God is not looking for those people. God is looking for the people who say, there's something wrong with me. So
not only will I not be creative with your word, but I'm not going to even, I have such awe that I will listen to to your precise words. And in order to go through those cherubim, you have to be very, very precise. Otherwise, those flames will eat you alive. And that's what happened to the sons of Aaron. And that's what would happen to us if we think that we can bring sacrifice, but our heart is still heavy, still fat, it'll burn. And that's the message of Isaiah. In a sense, there's really nothing new in this message, because this message is already in the Torah. But Isaiah and like the other early prophets, and then of course the later prophets, saying, you have to reinforce this message. And the only way for you to reduce your heart, to make it not fat, is to understand that there's something wrong with you. And last time, Don mentioned the idea of that we are all scarred. And we have to acknowledge those scars in us, because if we acknowledge the scars in us, then we acknowledge the scars in other people. And Tzion betzedek tipadeh. How do you go through that? How do you reduce your heart? By seeing something wrong with you, something wrong with others, and helping other people. So in justice will get you through those doors, and nothing else. Thank you.
I just want to add something. When we talked about redemption coming through affliction, in modern day and in many among many spiritual writers of Christianity, that whole idea of redemption and affliction, they're talking about true personal conversion or transformation. And conversion means a turning around, changing your mind. But many of them will say that conversion takes place primarily either through affliction or suffering or immense love. The two doors to conversion are affliction, suffering, and or love. So this whole idea of redemption and affliction go together here. We see that in Isaiah, but we see that being brought out more and more in the spiritual traditions, even within Christianity today. The other element is that among Christians, Isaiah is referred to as the prophet of God's holiness. And because Isaiah perceived the holiness of God, all right, there's no fiddling around with evil. All right, there are no white lies. They're all lies. All right, there's no skimping on your income tax here and there. It's the whole kit and caboodle. Because Isaiah is so sensitive to the greatness and glory of God that sin and evil have no place vis-a-vis God. So that's another perception from the Christian point of view. Well, there's no question in the fact that he was speaking to them. I mean, he was talking to them. You know, he was giving them God's message. But don't forget, the message of God was, for the prophet, bottom line, to get the people back to the covenant. So, you know, anything that he's saying, he's giving them ways to convert. But you have to convert. And they're saying, they're arrogant. Oh no, God's on our side. How often we've heard that, all right? In politics and so on. So there's an arrogance there, all right? And that'll become even clearer. That comes out very clearly when the northern kingdom is completely destroyed by Assyria, and the southern kingdom, Judah, becomes more arrogant because they say, well, look what God did to them. They'll never do it to us because we're the faithful ones. Ha ha. So there was an arrogance there. So obviously Isaiah is preaching through that, but it's a question of getting through the arrogance of people. I mean, you know as well as I do. A prophet shows up on the scene today, and you know what's going to happen. All right? I mean, he'll be destroyed politically, he'll be destroyed religiously, but that doesn't stop the prophet from preaching the message. I mean, we've seen too many prophets in our own age who have been rejected, who've been called, pinko liberal commies or X, Y, and Z. And we don't listen. We don't hear. We have ears, but we don't hear. All right? Because they're speaking out of the realm of a value system which is contra to the value system of God's people.
Yeah,
It's
actually the text in Hebrew uses the same word as also is in the Garden of Eden when God asked Adam and Eve, where are you? Eicha, ayeka, and the word in Hebrew is the same word. It's in it's in the first chapter, verse 21. And it says, how, so how is the same word as where in Hebrew. Eicha and ayeka, it's the same word. How, meaning it lost its way. How the faithful city has become a harlot. It's a very strong statement. But what it means is, and the word in Hebrew for a harlot is zonah, and zonah could actually be it's really never in a good context. There's Rahab, who was a zonah too, when the people of Israel came to Jericho, and she brought them in. But it also means that you can be too good. So, like, it's the same idea as giving, making love is good, but if you're overdoing it, you become a harlot. So it's the same, these ideas are the same. So you were a faithful city, and you became a harlot because you lost your way. And losing the way, and this is what I was trying to say, losing the way can be in a very small way. It doesn't have to be, but if you lose it a little bit, you change your trajectory, and then you're totally lost. So from here, it says that it's very easy to get lost. All you have to do is just overdo something, and you become and you're lost.
I just want to add one thing to that, Liz, because I'd done some reading, and I came across a quote from spiritual writer Thomas Merton. And Merton makes a very, very interesting comment. He said, nobody can get to heaven because nobody knows where heaven is. And that is why God has to send his chosen, whoever it might be Christ or the prophets, to show you the way to heaven. You can't do it alone, and very often these prophets will show you the way, but because they're not our way, because we think we know the way to heaven, we don't listen to them. Remember the last time, no, it wasn't here, it was one of the sermons I gave. Gadi, why don't you tell them, was it you who told me the story of the man falling in the hole?
Yeah.
Why don't you tell them the story?
And then
the doctor walks by and, no, somebody else told me the story.
No.
I
have a story of someone falling in a hole, but that's why I wanted to see.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of holes that people fall in. The very interesting stuff, a nice story. Fellow's walking along the sidewalk, and he falls through a manhole cover, a manhole. He falls into a manhole. That's kind of a play on the Good Samaritan. So he looks up and he sees a priest that he knows. And he said, Father, help me get out of here. So the priest says, just a minute, reaches into his pocket, writes something down, all right, throws it down to him, say, here, say this prayer for God's help, and then walks away. He looks up again, and he sees a doctor. He says, doctor, help me get out of here. So the doctor stops, pulls out his prescription pad, writes a prescription, throws it down to him and says, here, follow this prescription and get out of here. Looks up again and he sees a friend walking by. And he says to the friend, friend, please help me get out of here. So what does the friend do? He jumps into the hole. So the kid says, what are you doing down here? Now we're both in a hole. He says, yes, but I've been here before and I know the way out. And I think what we're saying here is that the way out are related to people who've been there before and know the way out. The prophets were people among their own people. Jesus was one sent by God who was a member of his own people. They know the way out of the hole, not by the people we think can give us prescriptions or prayers to get us out. So if we remember that parable, I think it'll help us put that, So how are we going to get to heaven? We're going to get to heaven by people who know the way. All right.
I found the verse that I was looking for before, because this is actually, and the reason I couldn't find it is because it was beyond the text that we were actually talking about. But this is a verse here that many people use it in different contexts, and I'll explain. It's in chapter 9, verse 9. So it's easy to remember if you go home and look at it. It says, bricks have fallen, which means the destruction of the temple. Bricks have fallen. We will rebuild with hewn stones. Sycamores have been cut down. We will replace them with cedars. Okay, what's wrong with this verse? What the people are saying, something happened in our life, right? Let's say the temple was destroyed, right? So it was built out of very nice material, right? The material that says bricks have fallen, so it's bricks, it's nice. But we will, after it was destroyed, not only will we rebuild it, meaning build the same, we will build it with hewn stone, with a nicer stone. It was from sycamore. Now we'll rebuild it with cedars. What's wrong with that?
They're all the same material.
They didn't understand the lesson, why their house was destroyed. That is the fat heart that can't see it. Something wrong happened, we will do it even better without learning the lesson. So you can't see the handicap in you. You can't see the lack. Oh, that never happened to me because of me. It happened because of somebody else. That they did something wrong. So we will show them and we will bring it and be more. They're thinking, they don't understand, when God brings the Assyrians to destroy the temple, it was that God brought the Assyrians. If you're going to rebuild the temple and you're going to make the temple, the house stronger, it's not going to help you. It's not going to help you because God will bring a worse enemy that will destroy that. You have to understand what was wrong inside. And one of the beautiful imagery here is that when Isaiah sees the vision of the seraphim, the angels with the 6 wings, and it says that the Amot HaSipin, the building kind of expanded, moved, and it was only filled by smoke, not even by anything physical, by smoke. and the building shifted. Which means that for God, it's not about the building. It's not about making the building stronger. It's about understanding the message. You know, we're now this evening is Israel's Memorial Day, and tomorrow night Independence Day. So they go hand in hand. It's exactly what redemption comes with affliction. The idea in Judaism is very strong that way, that our freedom comes with the sacrifice. We do look at we say we don't know what Hitler was, but what we know is what we can learn from it. And we say never again. So never again means to see early detection, early signs again. To say never again, it's not to now fortify and have a bigger army. Yes, it could be that too, which is the exact conversation in Israel is about that. It's not just about having a stronger army, but it's to detect in the world early detection. And it's not just early detection outside, but early detection with ourselves. Because Hitler, for example, said, I'm going to destroy you. Right? But we didn't listen. So there are people who could have run away. There was a time when they could have run away. Again, it's to blame people from 70 years later, it's difficult. But there was a point where Hitler said, you can leave. And they didn't. What? There was. In the early, and also in Russia, there was the same situation in the 20s, even before the 30s and in Germany. Already in Russia, when the government there changed of the revolution, there was a point where the Jews could have left. And then not to be subjected to the pogroms later. And in the land, they were letting them come to the land. Because it was now the British after the World War I. It was a very narrow bridge. I'm not saying where it was a narrow opening. But only a few used it. So there were a lot of things. But it's known that there were also statements from the Jews in those lands that said, no, the Jews in Russia said, no, especially after the revolution, which they helped. And they said, no, we're Russians, and we contribute to the revolution, now we're going to leave. No, we're proud Russians. And same thing in Germany. They said, we're proud Germans. It's not that the early signs did not speak to them as loud as they could have. For whatever reason, it's happened everywhere. It wasn't just in Germany. It happened in the Arab countries too.
Well,
and there are people who would say that. Yes, you would say that. Yes, but we have to be careful also how we use those terms, because we really don't know God's big plan. We can only know what we can say. But I will, just to give you another example of the we'll build stronger. There was exactly the same discussion here in America after 9/11. There were people who said, let's build the Twin Towers exactly the way they were and some people said, let's hold on for a second, let's learn the lessons and maybe do something a little different. And it's actually, I have to say, my instinct was, yes, let's rebuild it. They destroyed it, let's rebuild it. But then when it took 10 years and some time, and then eventually it was one tower, and they call it Freedom Tower, I thought, you know what? That is nice that they didn't do exactly the same. Meaning, whatever they learned, whatever the lesson we needed to learn or something after the fact, we did something a little wrong, a little different. We didn't say, let's build it the same and stronger. Same discussion happened everywhere.
Let me just follow through with that. With regard to instrumentality, God uses the Assyrians, for example, to destroy the northern kingdom. Okay? But always, God also destroys the instrument eventually.
Mm.
Okay, so it's not just that the Jews were doing God's will and they were attacked. No, they were not doing God's will. So God uses the Assyrians, but eventually God destroys the
Like
instrument.
Pharaoh in Egypt. Because God already, somehow the Assyrians were wrong in God's eyes, very much so. They're used to punish, but then God punishes them somehow too.
Individuality in Judaism really does not come into play until the prophet Ezekiel. It's Ezekiel who is the prophet who begins to focus on individual responsibility and accountability. All right? So we're not there yet. At least not before. We're getting close, but we're still here. And so Isaiah is obviously preaching primarily to the leadership. Okay? But then, it does spread out. Give you an example of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is not only speaking to, well, he's speaking to the exiles. And what Ezekiel does is he goes through a lot of his life pantomiming, literally pantomiming through the streets of what will happen. All right? So again, obviously people are going to see him. It's like sending out a tribe of Marcel Marceau, doing a pantomime through the streets of Manhattan. What's this wacko trying to say? And that's what people would say. He's crazy. But his call for people who could see, right, that somehow God was working through him through these pantomimes that he was performing.
Okay. Thank you very much.